Hi, I'm John MacArthur. I'm the head of the School of Architecture at the University of Queensland. In a moment, it's going to be my pleasure to introduce Jeffrey Inaba as the last of the School of Architecture talk series North by Northwest, and we've just been watching snippets of the discussion of North and Northwest, local and global. Now, as I expect that there'll be a lot of questions and discussions after Jeffrey's talk, I'm going to say a few thank yous now. So first of all, to the audience, for your enthusiasm for the series, for turning up week after week, and for your enthusiasm bringing quality architecture and discourse about it to Brisbane. So continue to demand that. To the State Library of Queensland for their generous provision of our venue, and especially to Jess Wazinski for managing the event each evening. To the Faculty of Engineering, Architecture and IT and their marketing team, Charlotte Kemmer, and for their promotion and for providing the refreshments. But our greatest thanks go to the staff of the school, to Erin Lewis, who's worked tirelessly in the often complex travel arrangements for the speakers, and to the director of the series, Andrew Wilson. Now, Andrew will be taking a rest from his role next year, and his shoes will be hard shoes to fill. It's Andrew's drive, his vision, his international networks, and his deal cutting with partner universities that have made this series such a success over the last couple of years. So let's thank Andrew and all those who brought this talk series together. So it's great to, I think Andrew might have saved the best for last, to introduce Jeffrey Inaba, who's Principal Inaba and Professor at Columbia University. Jeffrey is a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley and of the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. The firm Inaba's design approach stems from extensive background and analysis and planning and results in urban design proposals, buildings and artefacts and installations. We're pleased that Darian Williams, who's a lead designer and researcher in the firm Inaba, has been able to join Jeffrey on his visit to Brisbane. Jeffrey's taught at UCLA, at Harvard and at SCI-Arc. He's now a faculty member at Columbia and a founding director of Sealab, a think tank of Columbia University's Graduate School for Architecture, Planning and Preservation, which studies urban and architectural issues of public consequence. The lab's ideas are broadcast through Volume magazine, of which Jeffrey is a features editor, and numerous publications, including a recent book, World of Giving. Tonight, Jeffrey's going to show something of the work of Inaba and Sealab, discuss the role of research in architectural design. So please welcome Jeffrey Inaba.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to speak about my work. I'd like to thank Andrew especially for inviting me to come here, and he's been a great host, which I think is reflective of the hospitality of all of you at the university at large. Let's see, I'm going to talk about the work of Inaba and then also the work of Sealab, which is a research unit at Columbia University. And let me just go. Do you hear music? I don't know, is there a way to, I don't know, there's ambient music that I think that's coming out of somewhere. I'm not sure if it's, well, at any rate, I'll just continue. Hopefully you can hear over that. As an architect, I did the conventional thing. I did a bachelor's degree, and then I did a Master of Architecture degree. And after I graduated, I really loved design. I really loved it in school and enjoyed it, and I think I did fairly well. But for me, doing design unto itself was, in a way, a little bit empty, or I didn't know exactly what was meaningful to me as a designer. And so I took a little bit of a detour, and after working for some great offices, I decided to think about what research or content could be as an architect. And so Sealab represents, to a large degree, the culmination of a lot of different experiences that I've had that are research-oriented. And now, having the privilege to do some design work, everything from urban design to installations, that I feel like that I'm coming full circle in doing design, but with a sense of what content or what meaning means to me. And this is a detour, I think, is something that's not a personal journey of any sort, that it's a thing that is specific to my generation that was going to school, and that I think is relevant for you as students, insofar as students that you probably are really interested in design and becoming a really talented, accomplished designer. You're probably also interested in the latest software and how to best use that software. You're probably also very interested in fabrication technology and how to implement those technologies. You're probably also really interested in who is writing the latest interesting books on architectural history and theory. You might also be interested in public policy or social causes that you're interested in. And you're probably wondering how to integrate all of those things together into your practice. So if those manifold interests of yours is something that you want to begin to integrate together, I would say that this dichotomy between design and research that was part of my generation's journey is hopefully something that you might be able to learn from. With Sealab, officially what it's about is researching urban and architectural issues and communicating those to a greater public audience. And what we want to do is raise issues that we think are urban and architecture-based that have public consequences. So in thinking about what research is and what design is, I just present to you this as one piece of research that we've done in the past. It was for a contribution in Volume magazine that dealt with leaks, various kinds of leaks, like environmental leaks, information leaks, the way that buildings leak. And for it, we did this graphic with 2x4, a graphic design firm in New York. And with each of these blue circles that you see here, they show in metrically comparable terms the extent of each of these leaks. And then the dots here show the number of casualties with each of these leaks. So this is the kind of research and design we would do. We also do things like installations. This was for the last Whitney Biennial, and we were fortunate enough to be able to do a temporary restaurant in the Breuer building. So what's the relationship between design and research, and how do those things go together? Well, in our work, in the work of Inaba and Sealab, they're not linearly related. It's not a logical relationship between research and design. It's not that we go about doing some research and after a given period of time that we come up with some aha idea that we then can, in a very direct way, apply to our design work. It just doesn't work that way. But I would say that instead, that the research and design work that we do have commonalities. And those commonalities is that they all involve a sense of an aspect of assessment, hopefully an aspect of insight, and then also an aspect of making. So what I'll do for you today is go through some of our work and show you those three dimensions in work that varies from things that are policy and public policy and urban policy related to things that are kind of silly art projects, if you will. So part of what Sealab does is that we co-edit Volume magazine. It's an independent quarterly. We're on the 28th issue of it. We've done a number of different themes, from housing to sustainability, hope. We did 3 issues on architecture and power, and that those were at different scales. So architecture and power at a scale smaller than buildings, architecture and power at the scale of buildings, and then architecture and power at the scale of infrastructure in cities. We've looked at the Middle East. We've looked at China a number of times. In 2006, we had a guest editor do an issue on the economic crisis. In 2006, there wasn't an economic crisis, so it was kind of one of those like head scratchers, like what are you talking about, only to come to realization shortly thereafter. The aforementioned issue on leaks, agitation, both within the discipline and politically, counterculture, storytelling, are just a few of the things that we've done. So to give you a sense of of how we work. For the issue on storytelling, why we did storytelling was that we want to understand and appreciate the fact that when architects do things, that they have to tell stories to explain a situation, to understand what the current context is and what the proposition is. So this is an example from that issue, an example of making, I would say, that uses graphic techniques. So we looked at the fairy tale, and I think what was interesting for us was that, what we want to do is to communicate that the capacity of the fairy tale to tell complex stories had actually deteriorated. And if fairy tales were originally constructed as a way, not just for a child audience, but also for an adult audience, to understand morals and social values, that what we get today is a highly depleted version of the story of the fairy tale. So there are 4 versions of Sleeping Beauty that we looked at: the John Bautista version, the Perrault version, the Brothers Grimm, and the Walt Disney one. And each of the different editing of the fairy tale is represented by the different colors. So the red is Walt Disney, the green is Brothers Grimm, the blue is Perrault, and then the black is the original Bautista. So you could see that over time, the number of edits has changed the fairy tale drastically, to the extent that in the final Walt Disney version, the entire second half of the fairy tale is no longer there. This as an analysis and in presentation is something that we try to do in a way that that explains the situation concisely. Another thing that we do is we use photographs. A lot of time borrowed photographs. This is a contribution by Neil Denari. It's about Tokyo. And the thing that we've all heard is that cities are places that have tons of stimulus. But I think Tokyo is a unique example where there's so much stimulation that you just need to take a nap over the course of the day, maybe several naps. And taking naps in the subway is an okay thing to do. That you need that kind of stimulus in order to recover. I think another thing that's really interesting about Tokyo is that it's one of the few places where you could take a nap on the subway, but also feel safe enough that you could essentially unwind, to the extent that things like your personal belongings would be left to the wayside. Here, this guy has his backpack and his glasses, things. And that sleepiness or that overstimulation and the need to sleep is something that spills out from subways into the subway stations and streets of Tokyo. For the power issue at the scale smaller than buildings, what we want to look at was the accoutrements of power, an inventory of the things that are used as symbols or as used as dress in the exercising of power. And one of those things, at least in America, is hair. And so this is a documentation of the haircuts of the standing senators at the time. And one of the insights of this piece was that there are only about 4 hairstylists in Washington that senators go to, whether they're being on either side of the aisle. I think this is Hillary up there, among others. And so what we did was we took these different elements of power, these different symbols and dress codes of power, and we established a power kit with the idea that you could take the various attributes that are associated with these accoutrements and put them together in a mix and match way to develop leaders that could intervene in political logjams throughout the world. So, for example, in the Middle East, that you could have somebody that might be an eco-Saudi dictator that could broker peace between the Arabs and the Jews, but also be sensitive to the environmental conditions of the region. Again, before the housing crisis, the idea of a Native American real estate mogul who would be sensitive to the dynamics of mortgages and also of predatory lending. In the U.S., a Surgeon General that would believe in preventative medicine as an integral part of health insurance. Another thing that we do is we look at the term architect and how it's used in the public. And Richard Holbrooke, who is a diplomat, is often called the architect of the Dayton Peace Accord. And in that sense, he's called an architect metaphorically. But I think for us at Sealab and for our practice that Richard Holbrooke represents not a metaphorical use of the term architect, but a model architect in terms of what he does. Holbrooke, in brokering peace in the Balkans, was a person who deals then and now with space and policy. He's also a person that designs at multiple scales, and he's a person who can think about the consequences both at a regional scale and at the scale of furniture. So one of the things that he did in negotiating between the parties in the Balkans is that he made the border as long as possible. And so when you have a squiggly border like this, historically, that's what happens is that there's often less conflict. If you have a straight border between nations, that typically leads to greater conflict in terms of trade, in terms of relationships between people, between different cultures. And if you have a very squiggly border like this, that it encourages interaction across lines that are usually divisive. What he did at this scale, too, in making it as squiggly as possible, was that he had to decide who got resources, who would get access to water, where roads would go, and who would have access to the existing roadways, existing infrastructure like bridges, tunnels, so on and so forth. And so what he did was, like this thing is called the egg, and it was part of a water body that was given to one party, whereas another one called the Clark Corridor, after General Clark of NATO, was given over to another party as a way to create these more complex geometries. He also worked on the space of negotiation. He's the one that decided that the peace talks would occur at Wright Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, or outside of Dayton, Ohio. And one of the reasons why he selected this Air Force base is because it's very far away from any urban context. And so the parties were basically stuck there on the base to hammer out a deal. He also did things like decided where they would dine. And instead of doing shuttle diplomacy between the U.S., Europe, the Balkans, and elsewhere, that what he could do here was simply do shuttle diplomacy within the space of the dining hall. He also decided where people would sleep on the base, that he would have the parties here with the U.S. also here so that there could be movement and dialogue and discussion that would happen here with the Europeans being out to the side. Another thing that he talks about in his memoirs is that during the Vietnam War, that 4 months were spent deciding on the design of the negotiation table while soldiers on both sides died. And one of the things that he wanted to do was to make sure that there would be no sort of negotiation on the table itself. He designed the table and made people sit at it. And so this is the layout of the table, again, more or less with the Europeans on the outside. And so this is the layout of the table and the way that they worked and talked to one another, and also the layout for the photo ops. Another thing that we do at Sealab besides Volume Magazine is other publications, and we'll just do publications as the opportunity arises. This was one where some friends of ours were having an exhibition in New York, and we said, "Hey, we just want to be a part of it. What can we do?" And they said, "Well, just do whatever you want to do." One of the things that our friends do is they publish this magazine called Urban China magazine, which is probably the largest architecture magazine in China. It's really, really great. If you don't have it in the library, see if there's a way that you can get it. And so what we said was, well, we're going to bootleg your magazine. we're going to take content from your magazine and reproduce it in a magazine of our own. And the idea of taking copyrighted material from China and using it without rights permission was not a pun that they overlooked. So we took, content from them. What we did was that we had the theme of this publication be crisis because of the fact that that Lehman Brothers had happened maybe a month before. So we took the theme and we took material from their publication. This one was on natural crises. And so this article is about using reconstituted rubble as building blocks for construction in the Sichuan region. Another thing that happens during crises is this phenomenon called hyperinflation. Luckily, it didn't happen this time, but what happens when you have hyperinflation is that the value of the currency decreases to such a degree that you need more and more money to pay for items. So if a loaf of bread normally costs something like $4, in an instance of hyperinflation, it could cost something like $400. And as a result, what governments have to do is to print money in larger currency denominations. So here, in some countries, at some instances, you get things like $500 trillion notes and 50 billion notes. 5 billion is a small one, as you can see comparatively. We looked at crises and the way that they're depicted in movies. One thing that we know from Hollywood is that that Hollywood can portray protagonists, characters, very well, and especially through facial gestures and actions, that you can tell that some kind of crisis is going to happen within the narrative. What's also really good about Hollywood films is that usually the sky foretells that a crisis is going to happen. And as you know from movies that you love, that typically what it is that there's like a build-up of clouds, the sky turns gray, maybe it rains, there's lightning. And so with that in mind, what we did is we had a number of Sealab interns spend a week looking at a number of films and looking at the sky right before a crisis occurs. And what we discovered is that it's not just a gray sky right before a crisis. It could be any kind of sky. And so this is a Photoshop blurring together of a horizon of different skies from different movies right before the crisis occurs. So you get things like Wall-E and Wall Street and Waterworld and There Will Be Blood all blurred together to create a continuous sky condition. In addition to doing things like using Photoshop to depict things that we have crises with our computers as well. So just reload this. Another technique that we use, we use Photoshop as a technique to explain things. And in this instance, what we wanted to do was to talk about the potential of a double dip, a second crisis after the first crisis. Because, at least for the U.S., they're really, all the bullets are spent. There's no way to respond to another economic crisis. If lending is one method and decreasing interest rates is another as a way to respond to an economic crisis, both of those things have been applied. So if there is another economic crisis, really the U.S. has nothing to do, or nothing that is available to them to remediate that. So one proposition that we had was to look at the performance of different states in the U.S. and to take underperforming states and to sell those off to other nations as a way to generate revenue. And that the decision to declare this would be made by Vice President Biden, who comes from Delaware, which is a perennial underperforming state. The actual publication itself was something that was in crisis because it was something that we had to do very quickly. We put everything together in 6 weeks, from the start of it to the research to the collection of contributions and the printing. And one of the aspects when a publication is designed is that for the graphic designer, you never know how the material is going to come in. If you ask a contributor to do a 2,000-word essay, she or he might do an essay that's 1,800 words or 2,200 words. You might ask the contributor to provide 4 images, and they might provide 6 or 10. They might provide 10, and 5 of them might be really, really amazing. And even though you've dedicated just 4 pages to that article, you might want to increase that to 5 because you want to make some of the images bigger or smaller. So the whole dance at the end, when the pieces come in and you try to lay it out, is that you have to reallocate the pages of the publication. And also, one of the odd things is that the number of pages of publication is preset, essentially, at the very beginning of a publication project. So what we did, instead of trying to deal with this, because it would be impossible to figure out how many pages would be dedicated and allotted to various people, we just basically made the whole publication similar to a single Word document, where we just dumped in all the contributions one after another, not really caring where they would begin and end. So this is a layout where an article just basically begins at the beginning or in the middle of a page. This is a spread right here. And so the photo continues on the next page, so on and so forth. This is an installation that we're commissioned to do for the opening of the new museum by Sana. And what we proposed was that we would do a donor hall. And it wouldn't be a donor hall for the people who gave money to the museum itself, but people who give to culture and art in the world in general. And so what we began to do was to look at different organizations, individuals, foundations, countries that give to art and inventory it and use something really basic like a pie chart to show how these work with different industries and different sectors like religions, finance organizations, so on and so forth. So we basically used, you could see here the lines that show different organizations that give within that particular sector. In addition to having these pie charts, what we did was we took photographs of pies and other round-shaped foods and underlaid those onto the diagrams. So here's a pizza, here's a donut over here on that side. And then this is the installation in the new museum. In thinking that this would be an immersive environment and something that might be up for a while, and it actually turns out that it has been up for quite a while, largely because I think they may not have the donations going to the museum to pay for something else to go in the space. But given the fact that it would be something immersive and something that maybe people would see as they're waiting to go into the auditorium for an event at the new museum, what we did was that under each of the photographs, we produced this mini text. And the text is a 6-point text. So, like, this is the speck on that donut that you saw, and we filled it with text. So you can kind of sort of make out here the text embedded in there. And we gathered up quotes on giving from Aristotle to Oprah Winfrey, and then included those into the piece. Again, I mean, in a way, you can think of this lecture as what my office and Sealab did during the crisis. After we did the installation, the crisis occurred, and the thing that we're curious about is whether or not people stopped giving during economic crises. So, for example, with the tech bust in the early 2000s, the red represents the Dow Jones Industrial Average. In the early 2000s, with the crash then, people didn't stop giving. The amount of annual giving actually stayed about the same. And so what we were curious about was what would happen in here. And that one conclusion was that the level of giving is definitely not related or proportional to the growth of an economy. In looking at this information, we proposed to do a book called World of Giving. And in World of Giving, we did very simple things, like just looked at what are gifts, what things are given as gifts. Another thing that we did was we looked at the interpersonal dynamics between people, like why a person gives to another person, and that altruism or doing a favor for a favor isn't the only reasons why people give, that self-interest is also a reason why people give, and that self-interest is not necessarily a bad thing in terms of the larger scope and consequences of donations from one to another. So the idea that part of the inside of the book was that the dynamics of individual giving, whether it's altruistic or less altruistic, would be something that could be promoted. We also did something that I haven't seen in any other book or research on giving, is to show on a global scale the mechanisms between people who give and people who receive. So this maps out the flow of aid from one person to another through multinational banks, governments, and other intermediary entities. We also looked at what we call aid capital. And one of the aspects of aid capital is that when you give aid. But one thing that's generated from that aid is knowledge and information. So let's say if you're an architect and you have a social interest and you're kind of figuring out how do they relate to one another. And one of the things that happens in aid is that if, let's say, there's an idea of giving to a medical cause, there's a question of how much money should go to medicine and drugs and how much money should go to building of hospitals. And the policy of deciding those things, I think, is partly a thing that should involve architects. Another thing is that once, say, a hospital is built, where does that knowledge go of knowing how to get resources to build a hospital and implementing it in difficult situations? And through aid capital, there's always a feedback mechanism of knowledge that's exchanged from the recipient back to the giver. And the generation of communication between giver and recipient is so extensive that I think you can't call just one party a giver and the other a recipient, that there's exchange that happens where the original giver receives information that's invaluable for a next enterprise. Another thing is that aid capital is different than other capital. If you think about, say, human capital, which is, you think of as labor or things that you do for one another, or political capital, which might be influence that one exercises, or social capital, which you all know, that each of those things are ones where after you've spent that capital, it goes back to zero. You don't have anything left. For example, with political capital, if someone does a favor for you, you might remember that, but then when you call that person back and ask for a favor, that after the favor is done, you got the parties are back to square one, back to zero. But with aid capital, it's different. Aid capital builds and accumulates. What we found out was that people generally have a desire to volunteer, and people will continue to volunteer and actually increase the hours that they volunteer if they believe that the organization that they're volunteering for is not exploiting their goodwill, and that they tend to invite other people to participate as well when they believe that the organization doesn't exploit their time. So in that sense, if an organization works well and communicates what it does and doesn't take advantage of the people who volunteer, that organization can grow and grow and accumulate both aid in terms of hours that people dedicate to that particular cause, but also the generation of knowledge and information that comes with that. With World of Giving, we also looked at things like aid professionals. people who dedicate their lives to giving, like the case of the American nuns. The Vatican a number of times has reprimanded the American nuns because they go outside of the fold to help people. Basically, their strategy is to go into intense urban environments and engage people there rather than attempting to draw people into churches. At the very end of World of Giving, we took all of the UN-approved architecture for crises, so everything from dynamite exploders to instant buildings to water trucks. In terms of the making of World of Giving, one of the things that we did was we wanted to make the book interesting and well-designed. And in terms of the design, what we could really mostly afford is one-color printing. So, what you think of as black and white printing only. But what we did was we made each of the signatures, each printed section of the book, a single color, but a different color. So as you go through the book, each 16-page break is a different color. And what I think is nice about that is that those breaks don't correspond to the chapter breaks, so that throughout the book you just get these changes in colors in a arithmetically consistent way, but not in a content corresponding way. And we left full color for the end of the book. One of the things that was an insider realization of doing the book was not a realization that we had, but a realization that other people had. They realized that we might be good at this volunteering stuff, and so they started to ask us to do projects pro bono. And so we started to make things like tables and installations for fundraisers for different organizations. And so with this, we were asked to put together the design of a table that would be for one evening, and that this table would have to be assembled in one afternoon. It was great that the context for this particular fundraiser was in the Park Avenue Armory in New York, and inside of this Louis Comfort Tiffany dining hall that has been beautifully preserved. One of the rules of thumb with designing a table is that you need 1 linear foot per guest. And they had 60 guests in a room that was 35 feet long, so we had to curve the table in order to get everyone inside. There was no budget for this particular table, so we had to use reclaimed materials. And what we discovered at the very end was that the material that we had for the tabletop was MDF that was gotten from some construction site, and that the MDF was only 3 millimeters thick. And it was already used, which means that it was not more stable than, say, a tablecloth. But what we did was we designed the table to accentuate that thinness. And what we did was if this is 8 feet from here to here, we pulled back the supporting beams a little bit to the inside so that you would really see the thinness of the table. We got asked to do more and more of these tables, so we've actually done 6 so far, and for free. And oftentimes the time constraints are less and less. For this particular one, the first one was so successful that with this one, they had 120 people that had paid for this fundraiser, and it turned out something like 140 people showed up. And the layout of the space was weird because it had these columns. And so we had to fit in, we really liked this idea of doing one table, so we had to fit in everyone into this one area here. This was the stage for the event, and that's the event. But what we did was that the idea of it being one table with so many people is a thing that if it was a linear table, like the first one that you saw, you could only talk to the person that's across from you. And by making the table have all of these Y intersections, it meant that you could talk to at least 2 other people looking at diagonals one from another. Let's see. Another thing that we've observed is that about crisis is that sometimes things that are built to be permanent no longer remain, or they go away. So this was a rooftop pavilion that Dan Graham did for the DIA in New York. But after the crisis, the DIA moved out of that space, and they took the Dan Graham with it. Another arts organization moved in thereafter, and they asked us to do an installation, a rooftop pavilion, to replace the Dan Graham that was there. This rooftop that they asked us to do was a thing that was supposed to be up just for the summer. It would be temporary. And so what we proposed to them was that we would make a rooftop terrace made out of pool noodles, given the fact that it was summertime. And so this is the pool noodle seating area that we made. It was used for openings and receptions and for film screenings. In making this, we used 5,000 pool noodles, which are, I think, 6 feet long, and we chopped them up into 16,000 pieces. Again, with this project, it wasn't a thing where there was a lot of money, and the only way that we could get it done was through essentially a group of people who were committed to participating in the project. So 30 people worked on it for 13 days in order to assemble the pool noodles into what it became. Some things that are temporary become permanent. This is a project that we did for a hospital in Rome. It's a waiting room for the hospital. And it's really amazing because in Rome, even if you do a temporary structure, there's so many things that you have to deal with. With this particular project, we had to have a state archaeologist come out and look at the site of this temporary pavilion to make sure that there weren't any Roman ruins on the site. Their conclusion was that they weren't sure. But just to be careful, they said that the foundation could be no deeper than 40 centimeters. So this project that is 9 centimeters tall has a foundation that's really, really shallow. And so we had to design a foundation that was spread out over a really great distance in order to compensate for the fact that it couldn't be deep. This was one of the first structures that, as an office, we were commissioned to do. And one of the challenges when you're just beginning a practice is how do you come up with forms, and what forms can you design that a young office can finesse and make beautiful? And with this particular project, the people who worked on it were all very young and fresh and green. And the challenge for us was how could you use really simple forms, but in the end deal with geometry and spatial problems that aren't simple. So with this, the idea of how do you transition from a relatively low space into a tall space. So this is a part of the outdoor part of the waiting room, and this is the indoor. And we want to use these, we didn't want to, we really were resigned to using fairly simple forms like this Pac-Man shape. But in making the Pac-Man shape, I think that we came up with a section that actually is more complex than the outside form might reveal. And then we use this low element to be the entryway to go into that taller element. And in the end, the clients, after the thing was built, they said, well, you know, we don't know what to do because if we take this pavilion down, we're going to look like total assholes because, you know, we're taking away a waiting room from a hospital. And so what they did was they lobbied with the local government to make it permanent. And in fact, now it's a permanent structure. I wonder if all along they had this in mind, that they would propose to do they proposed to do a temporary structure, and given the fact that it was for a hospital, and if it was benefiting the hospital in any way, that it would be very difficult in the context of Roman politics to take it away. A funny thing is that sometimes we do these temporary projects that turn out to be permanent. Sometimes we do these projects where we're asked to do them and assemble them in an afternoon, and they're only up for an evening. With this particular project, we were told that it could only be up for 2 hours. And so we're getting kind of worried because if you just kind of extrapolate that sometimes we are asked to do things for 4 months, and other times we're more recently asked to do things for for 2 hours. So we're worried that the next client that comes to us is going to ask us to do something that's only up for 30 minutes or something. But for this particular one, the reason was that it was at the storefront for art and architecture, and they didn't want to get a permit for the installation that they asked us to do. So the idea was that it had to go up and be used and come down before the police would come by, because if the police came by and saw that it wasn't permitted, that the storefront would get a fine. So the theme of the show was landscapes of quarantine, and what we proposed was to quarantine the storefront, if you will, containing the ideas in it so that it wouldn't contaminate the rest of the city. And we used the doors as the point of departure, the really beautiful doors that Vito Acconci and Stephen Hall designed for the storefront, and we covered them up. And the installation is called Suck Blow. So it sucks air into the storefront in one door, and then it blows air out in the other. So this is Suck, and that's Blow here. It turned out that the police showed up twice, and because we had organized this in such a way that was akin to a military operation, they just assumed that there was a permit. They didn't even ask for it, and the thing went down pretty well. But it is a thing where, and so these are the interiors of Suck and Blow. But it is really a weird thing that as an architect that you design a creation and design the way that it's going to be realized, but that also part of what you do is to design the destruction of your own work to make sure that it gets out in time, but also that in the destruction of the work that you budget that in to the overall construction budget. So selling back the metal pieces to the fabricator was part of the way that we were able to do the project within the budget. We don't just work at a small scale, we also work at larger scales. So this is a self-initiated planning study that we're doing looking at the location of middle-class neighborhoods in New York. And the fact that middle-class neighborhoods are essentially dissolving, they're refiguring, they're going away. And in fact, I think there isn't really a clear, decisive conclusion of what's happening to the middle class, except for the fact that in numbers they're decreasing. But spatially, just what's going on is unclear. So if you take a generic idea of what the middle class in New York is by household income, the black area are what's generally categorically called the middle class. But if you take away those areas where 30 to 50% of the household income is used to pay for rent, that you get a figure something like this. And if you take away people whose per capita individual income is greater than $43,000 a year, you get a figure like this. If you take away within those households individuals who make less than $25,000 a year, the figure deteriorates down to this. If you count the number of families that own their home, meaning that they do have some available capital, the figure balloons up to this again. But if you take away from that households that have people over 65 who aren't really drawing in income, that it decreases down to this. If you take away people who have dependents, it decreases down to this. If you look at people, families where they only have a high school education, meaning that particular generation doesn't have the possibility of advancing, possibly, that it's something like this. So if this is the maximum definition of the middle class, and this is the minimum, what we're interested in is this gray zone, this figure that really isn't a thing that describes neighborhoods per se, and what we want to do is make proposals for this area that's the most dynamic and fluid and unstable in terms of who lives there. A project that my office did jointly with Darian Williams was for a planning exhibition in Los Angeles. And we looked at the Hollywood sign. The Hollywood sign was put up by a real estate developer in the 1920s. And this real estate developer did a development right below the sign called Hollywoodland. This particular area of the Hollywood Hills is, in terms of geography, views, access, no different from all the other parts of this hill. So if you go half a mile down or half a mile to the other side, it's not like there is a salient difference in terms of the inherent qualities of this particular area. But because the sign is there, the real estate values in this neighborhood are substantially higher than half a mile to the east or to the west. And that's been the case ever since the sign went up. So in that sense, the sign has done its duty. It's obsolete. It's no longer necessary in the sense that it's served its purpose of increasing the value to that neighborhood. So one thing we had in mind in proposing it was that you could rent out the signs to middle-class neighborhoods in Los Angeles so that they could increase the property value of those their neighborhoods and of their homes. And just depending upon the money that they could scrape together, that they could rent out maybe 4 letters or 2 or 3, as the case might be. In looking at things like planning ideas, with Sealab, what we're doing is looking at alternatives to long-term infrastructure. Because of the fact that with the economic crisis, the cities don't have as much money to pour into long-term infrastructure projects, what are things that cities can do? And could there be temporary or short-term projects or things that could be realized within a year that could help cities to improve in lieu of large infrastructure projects? But also, maybe, could it be the case that something like this, something like temporary projects, could help cities to reconsider how to build in the future? This particular video that we did is about... okay, not getting audio. What this particular video is about is the introduction of bike lanes in New York. And they were meant to be temporary at the beginning as a test trial, and it turned out actually to be quite successful to the point where they become more permanent in New York. But even a greater benefit of this bike lane thing is that there are ideas now that are floating that maybe streets aren't just for cars. Maybe the accommodation of the car isn't what streets are for, that streets could be used for other things and for other programming, even to the extent that streets could become the building blocks for the city in the future, that instead of thinking about how you might tear down a building and put up another building or how you might increase the parkland area, that you could use the streets themselves as things that could be constructed or built upon or modified as a way to do urban planning in the future. So if thinking about temporary alternative interventions as a conceit or an excuse to think about ways in which cities could develop in alternative ways, what we're also doing is looking at elderly housing and elderly accommodations in cities. And of course, we want to make sure that the elderly are better served, but we also want to use the research and ideas that we come up with as a way to think about how planning could occur at a larger scale within cities. And this is a thing that we did for the city of New York. We do commissions in our office of an urban scale. This was a commission for $1.5 5 million square meters of housing in St. Petersburg, Russia, to accommodate 45,000 people. And one of the interests of the developer was how to accommodate the increased interest in private car ownership of the middle class in Russia, and that this is a development needed to make sure that it responded to that. The developer also asked that the development be a green development. We said, yeah, sure, we could do that. We're really into that. And so we came up with all these ways that the development could be sustainable. And he said, oh, no. I didn't mean it that way. I just wanted some areas of the project to be green in color. And that doing something sustainable just wasn't something that would be possible given the budget he had in mind for this development. But what we did was we looked at it from a cost analysis point of view, and in terms of urban infrastructure, the greatest cost goes to the construction of roads. Roads are costly to do. And so what we proposed to him was to eliminate as many roads as possible. So with this development, we did this pedestrian and bicycle walkway that loops around the entire development. And in doing that, we're able to connect a number of different neighborhoods in the east-west direction. And then we're thereby able to eliminate all east-west roads. And substantially decreasing the overall construction budget of the project. After that, the developer said that he thought that green ideas were really good. This is the project I showed at the very beginning, this commission for a temporary restaurant at the Whitney. And we were really grateful to do a project that was able to go into the double-height courtyard space of the Breuer building. And so what we did was we proposed to do these giant lanterns that would extend the whole distance of that double-height space. So here's the section through this is the ground level, this is the lower level where the restaurant is. So we made these lanterns that went there. So here's the view from the outside. Here's a view from the main level looking to the outside. In terms of the question of how to make things, we found out that it would be cheaper to make it in California, to fabricate this in California, and then ship it out to New York. We also want to make something that was very sculptural. With this particular piece, we had to make the piece out of one mold because we just couldn't afford having more than one mold. And we had to make the mold 8.5 feet wide so that they could fit on the truck to go from California to New York. So this is what you see here. And as an architect, during the last 3 years, we just did this casual, quick calculation, and it turns out that at least 50% of the projects that we do don't touch the ground, which is really weird that as architects we don't really deal with foundations all the time. Nevertheless, we do deal with structure even when things hang. So for this particular project, the fiberglass shell up here is suspended from the ceiling and then in turn structures a light ring that's at the bottom of the piece. And then we just use the sailcloth as the structural element that holds the piece down at the bottom. And then in the other element, the big fiberglass shell at the bottom is held up by the sailcloth in the center here. In doing projects like this, we try to do everything. So we did not only these large lanterns, but tables for the restaurant. We did the counter, service counter for the restaurant. We also did the chairs. So this is just, we did these seat covers. So this is just your basic plastic stackable chair. And we did this upholstered seat cover for it. And together, the two things cost $45 US. We also designed the T-shirts. The name of the restaurant was Sandwiched. So this is the front of the T-shirt, and this is the back of the T-shirt. One thing that we really want to do was the number card. So after you order your food, you're given the number, and you take it to your table, and then the server comes and gives you your food. And so what we proposed in making these order cards was that we would do a Whitney Museum of American Art collection of materials to the building. So with each of these order cards, the front of it is the front face of one of the materials in the building, and the back is the back face of that particular material. And I think even with doing things like this, that the cumulative effect of a number of things that you design in a project can have a larger impact in terms of the way that any kind of designed environment is received. This is my favorite one. This is the glass of the thing. This is a recent project that we won as a competition. It's to do this huge light element in a new opera house in Norway. This is the overview of it. One of the things that this project does, it's a permanent commission, is that it frames views from inside of the opera house to other parts of the opera house. It also responds to the extreme light conditions in Norway, the attenuated summers and attenuated twilight that they have, as well as the really shortened days that occur in the wintertime. In working with the engineers, one of the big challenges was how to suspend this thing from the ceiling of the concert hall. So, and then also, how do you fabricate something that's translucent in its surface in a way that's cost-effective? So, similar to the Whitney project, we're going to use a single mold to do all of the cladding elements. And the way we're able to do it with something that's as complex as this is that, in reality, this as a form is just a pure cylinder. It's just that it's chopped up in different ways to get this more dynamic form. And one of the reasons why it's chopped up the way it is to create these views through the space, but also as a way to make the structure as economical as possible. For an installation like this, the most cost-effective way to structure it is to hang it as a pin connection from the roof. So we're just supporting it without any kind of rigid support this way from the ceiling. And so if you support a cylinder from one end like this, it's just going to hang like that. And so what we did was we added a little bit of material on this side, shaved off a little bit of material on that side. So the natural angle of incidence of the piece is that. It's just the pure weight balance of the thing that makes it hang. And so what we did was we designed it to be sculptural by subtracting this amount of area to get that angle. And then we also made that angle of repose of the structure be a thing that aligned with the angle of incidence of the sun at given parts of the year. Okay, the last project I'll talk about is probably the smallest constructed thing that we've done. It was a series of kiosks that we did for a Festival of Ideas in New York that recently took place. Again, in trying to be cost effective, we worked with a fabricator who uses robots to fabricate things. And one of the benefits of doing this is that if you have a robot fabricate it, that it's a lot cheaper because it takes away the cost of human labor to construct this object. So this is, it's a robot. It's sort of like a 6-axis milling machine, and it's a repurposed robot from the auto industry. And in making this information kiosk, we realized that the robot could contour the surface basically in any way that we wanted to. So what we did in making it was that we just very roughly got a whole bunch of MDF and slapped it together as the core of this information kiosk. And then we used the robot to sculpt the MDF to the point where the MDF surface could be made into something that was really smooth and continuous. So this, you see here, is the step-over line of the path of the tool bit on the robot, which contoured the surface of the thing. So in a way, one of the big realizations of the project is that in using robot technology, you reduce the labor, but what it also does is it makes available an aesthetic surplus, if you will, that there are things that you could do with the robot aesthetically that you couldn't do otherwise, that you could come up with much more complex geometries than you could if you did it by manual labor. So these are the pieces. One of the things we didn't realize was that even if you do use robots and shaping and putting in fabricating the object. That doesn't mean that when you assemble it that you always have a robot to help you to do that. It turned out that these pieces weighed something like 300 pounds. Each of the sections weighed 300 pounds. So it took 6 of us all night down on the Bowery to put this together in time for the festival to begin. So this is a 250-pound piece that we had to get 10 feet, over 10 feet into the air within the loading dock of the Sana building, which is narrow and pure white. We were luckily enough we didn't make too many scratches or on the inside of it. So this is the kiosk. It has a touchscreen video monitor as well as a video monitor on top that played videos related to the festival. This is it in front of the new museum. And then here's some shots of it in front of the Morphosis Cooper Union building. We made 2 of them, 1 for each site. Here's the contoured surface of the kiosks. And for us, we think of each of these projects as projects that are proto-architecture, that we take the knowledge of these installations and these small projects and think of ways in which the information could be exported to different scales. The thing with this information kiosk that was kind of curious was that though the organizers of the festival wanted us to do these things, they didn't really know where they would go. We didn't know then what the site or orientation of these kiosks would be. So we designed it in a way where each of the different sections could rotate in a number of different ways, and we designed it so that the language of the curvature of the pieces could be a thing that could be organized and oriented in multiple directions. So the idea that finding technologies that allow you to fabricate things that give you the opportunity to formally explore things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do, and then also to use the formal language that you come up with to respond to things like the orientation of a designed object, or just some of the things that we learned with this particular project. But I think it just underscores the idea that the evaluation of a given program or context, and then thinking about ways in which you can take advantage of the making process are things that are harmonious and continuous in the work that we do. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
Thanks.
Take a seat.
Okay.
Thanks very much for your talk. It's very engaging. And the scale of the work, the breadth of the work, and the breadth of thinking is truly impressive. So I wonder if we could start with calling for questions from the audience.
Can I start? You have to be amazed.
Can we wait for the microphone will move around?
It's amazing the range of material and projects that you undertake. I mean, this last project, these kiosks, for example, how many of them were commissioned?
There were 2 that were fabricated.
How?
There were 2 that were fabricated.
Oh, right,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
But you also do this sort of philanthropic work, pro bono.
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The Sealab is basically financed by whom?
It's an entity of the university, of Columbia University. So with a lot of those projects. Yeah, that's right.
I'd like to ask a little bit about your concept of content.
Yeah.
I was interested that you use an architect's point of view to discover a new kind of content that there might be there in the world. And I guess it's an interesting term in the sense that it's broadly based in culture today, in the sense that we feel as if we have new forms of communication, new forms of media, and there's always a shortage of things for them to transmit. There's a shortage of substance in the world.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that your work has discovered various kinds of substance, which, and you show the intrinsic interest of things that might escape less sharp eye, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess my question is, that content that you're finding, how much do you think that is specific to architecture? Do you think there's a kind of an architectural content, or do you think the things that interest you, like, say, was thinking particularly about the sociopolitics of the middle class housing project. They're rather the content of the public sphere as a whole. So I guess I'm asking about, like the economy of content.
Yeah, I mean, with both Sealab, this research unit, and my office, I think for us, we see our work as being specifically architectural. That what we're interested in is the advancement of the field of architecture and the advancement of knowledge and about how to design. What I think helps us, or what inspires us along, is this idea that we can find content or meaning in anything that we look at. So it could be something as random as philanthropy or giving, also with the middle class. In the end, what we want to do is to communicate the things that we find, the insights that we generate that might be related to broader extra architectural issues, like in the case of the middle class one, just where middle class people live. But I think it also is a way for us to think out opportunities to design and to do interventions as architects that would not otherwise be seen as pressing contexts that could be used to develop work. So I think in that sense that the insights that we generate are oriented to architecture. They are also things that lead us to doing design proposals. So I think in that sense, that motivates the architecture component. We certainly do hope that in the work that we do, that it's a thing where you don't have to be an architect to appreciate it, and that also sometimes the information that we generate goes beyond an architecture audience in terms of what benefit it has, and that's something that's very much a project of ours.
Yeah, your presentation was brilliant, thank you, and it's very holistic. But what intrigues me is a lot of the projects start off in a conceptual sense as temporal, ephemeral, but end up being permanent. So what's the process in the change from going from temporal to permanent?
In the forms or in the ideas?
The whole process, really.
Yeah.
Getting it approved by public authorities and...
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something that we've learned, along the way. Like both learning the hard way that some things that we would want to be up for a long time aren't up for a long time, and vice versa. But I think one of the reasons why people come to us is that we're able to generate ideas and insights, including opportunities that other people may not have been able to do. And so one of the consequences of that is to do things that might have a temporary nature, but then they become permanent. Or that a project might be temporary, but the ideas that we come up with and the things that could be done thereafter have lasting effects.
I was struck at how close some of your work is to contemporary visual arts, and thinking how intimidating it must have been to replace Dan Graham's work on the Dyer Foundation.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit, about that kind of convergence that's happening between the physical nature of a lot of contemporary art and the fact that a lot of contemporary art uses building or building-like forms, and how that crosses over with your practice?
Yeah, I mean, just as it was mentioned in the introduction, I went to UC Berkeley as an undergrad, and one of the things that I've had to deal with was that education, because at that point in time at UC Berkeley, it was so important that everything that you did was interdisciplinary throughout the university, not just the architecture school. So, and one of the consequences of it now is that they have a Center for Media Studies, and basically it's just about the promotion of interdisciplinary collaborations. What interdisciplinary meant in practice was something I think that was less critical of an issue, and there wasn't a lot of scrutiny about what interdisciplinary meant. And I feel like with the projects that we do, we don't want to be interdisciplinary. We don't want to be people who do a diverse range of projects using a diverse set of media that are inspired by the knowledge from different disciplines. I think everything that we do is generated and has coherence in terms of the type of logical analysis that we do as architects. So I think that with all of these instances, whether it's a film or whether it's an installation or an urban planning project, that the thing that we think has unity in it is this idea of the rigor of the problem solving that takes place.
Another question up here. With the breadth of the projects that you showed, there was great breadth in it across film and print and architecture itself, buildings and installations as well. Have you ever done anything in digital interactive environments? For example, did you design whatever it was that was shown on the kiosks?
Yeah, I mean, we have 2 commissions right now to do iPad applications. I think that we have a friend, a scholar who's obsessed with Montessori education, and the idea that as a Montessori student that you're given at an early age the encouragement and confidence to look at anything that you want to across disciplines and then kind of go at it. And he has this whole idea about a Montessori conspiracy. So everyone from the Google founders to Jeff Bezos to a number of different people are all, and including Rem Koolhaas, are all Montessori alum. I mean, I think for us that it's an interesting, claim that somehow we're people who don't feel anxiety about working in different media, but I think I guess I would insist that with everything that we do that hopefully it's understood as being consistent with all the other things, and that's something that we strive for. And what I think another thing that's really interesting is that with Sealab in particular, even though we deal with economics, we deal with business, we deal with geography and planning, on average, like 80%, 70% of the people that are working at any one given time are trained as architects. And I think it's the training of being an architect that allows for the particular insights to be generated, even though we might borrow from expert knowledge in other fields.
I think it certainly shows in what you presented this evening that there is this consistent line of engagement through the work that's based on analysis and comes from the mind of an architect. I think it's amazing that you're able to work across so many media with so many technologies. Jeffrey, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.